My name is Sheridan Steele, and I'm retired from the National Park Service. Spent 38 years working in the national parks. Land preservation was always my highest priority. And let me see, I spent 6 years at Rocky Mountain National Park and 7 years at Black Canyon down the road here. And my last 12 years, I was superintendent of Acadia National Park in Maine. And so I'm going to tell you three short stories. There are actually three different little programs, PowerPoints, and then we can answer questions or talk more if you'd like. The first one is about Black Canyon, and I was there, let's see, 1996 to 2003. It became a national park in 1999, and I'm going to tell you the story how that came about. Because it involved quite a bit of negotiation and relationship building to make it all happen. So when I went to Black Canyon in 1996, there had been 2 or 3 attempts, legislative attempts, to make it a national park through Congress. And it takes you may know, a national monument can be established by the President of the United States just signing a proclamation. Every other unit of the national park system requires an act of Congress. So to make Black Canyon a national park, it had been made a national monument in 1933. But to make it a national park required an act of Congress, and that's not easy these days. It's not easy at all. So, but I'll tell you a little bit about that. So Black Canyon, many of you have probably been there. Have you been there? So it's worth your time. If you get nearby, you should go. It's 2,700 feet deep. It's a magnificent narrow canyon, 40 feet wide at its narrowest point. And as I said, it was made a national monument in 1933. It was a national monument when I arrived. This is an aerial that shows you the South Rim Drive, which is the primary visitor use corridor. And the campground is there at the top, and the visitor center was right on the rim right here. When I arrived, it was a double-wide trailer that was temporary. But 35 years later, it was still temporary. They were trying to make it, trying to get an appropriation to make a visitor center. And it was really, I would say, in less than standard shape. And when I got there, and I thought, well, one of the things we need to do is upgrade facilities. And so I worked this was the terrible condition of the trailer, very cramped. You can literally put your finger through the walls in places, and it had been there so long. We sold it for $100 just to get rid of it, and somebody moved it off-site. I don't know what they did with it, but it was recycled, I like to say. And then our crews prepared the site. I negotiated with Frontier Log Homes in Montrose to build a log house that would become the visitor center, and at a substantial discount thanks to them. And so we moved it out, redid the site, and built a floor in the fall. And we had a temporary trailer there for information purposes. But then Frontier Log Homes built this house or structure on their property, took it apart, brought it up, and put it back together again. And it became the visitor center on the South Rim. And they were for years, they were trying to get an appropriation of $5 million to build a visitor center. We did this whole thing for $500,000. And with our crews putting on the roof and doing some of the other work, but it turned out really nicely. So this was before it was a national park. Yeah. And we had a big dedication ceremony, and Senator Campbell came, and Representative McGinnis, And I think that really helped grease the skids for the legislation that came about. We then used the same kind of motif to replace the entrance station and the restrooms and so on. But my concern when I got there was this. There was a big ranch, 2,000-acre ranch, right on the South Rim Drive. Privately owned. You would often find cows on the Rim Drive as visitors coming to the National Monument. And so I really wanted to see the legislation get approved. And I knew it was going to take a totally different approach. And I wanted to take a totally different approach. What had happened was the Park Service did a study and said, what would it take to make it a national park? And their answer was, add the 50,000 acres downstream that was the national concert or the national, anyway, it was the Gunnison Gorge Bureau of Land Management land. And Bureau of Land Management is part of the Department of Interior, like Park Service is. And so they were two bureaus that didn't agree. They didn't want to give up their Gunnison Gorge. And so the Department of Interior would not testify in favor of the legislation because they had two bureaus that were in opposition or in opposing one another. Anyway, I took a look around and I said, we don't need the 50,000 acres downstream. What we need to do is better protect the Black Canyon, and that includes doing something with the Sandberg Ranch, 2,000-acre ranch, and that straddled the South Rim Drive. And so the new proposal was to add the Sandberg Ranch. I'll show you a close-up of this map. So this became the legislative map, and the dark there is the Sandberg Ranch, and these other pieces were just added to make a better proposal, including 5,000 acres downstream of BLM land that was upstream of their first public access point. So we negotiated, and they said they would be willing to give up those 5,000 acres, and they'd be willing to then support the idea of legislation. So that's how it actually came about, except Senator Campbell became the chair of the Senate Subcommittee on National Parks. So a really key position. So between negotiating with the primary landowners that would become part of the park and Campbell becoming in this critical chairmanship role, we actually got legislation to move in 1999, and it became a national park in 1999. But the key factors were the Sandberg Ranch was highly developable, even though there were cows on the road now. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, there could have been a whole bunch of homes with street lights and mowing grass and all the other things that happen around private property. And that would have been right along both sides of South Rim Drive. It would have been, no longer would it have been really, in my view, worthy of national park status. Anyway, the Conservation Fund, who we have someone here from the Conservation Fund, they played a critical role twice. First, they negotiated and got a conservation easement on the Sandberg Ranch, but it allowed 5 development pieces within that easement. And we developed those by GPS and determining where they would be least visible and so forth. Anyway, it became a kind of a really partnership. Conservation Fund negotiated, got that conservation easement on the Sandberg property, and later on they played another role, which I'll tell you in a minute. But critically, they put in the first right of refusal in that easement if it was to ever be sold. And sure enough, 10 years later, the Sandbergs decided to sell. And the Conservation Fund stepped up again and bought it, later to get Land and Water Conservation Fund money to buy them out. But that fully protected the Sandberg Ranch as part of the national park, which happened in 1999. I mentioned Campbell was on this subcommittee. The successful legislation happened in 1999. and it became a national park. I was invited to go to the White House and to the Oval Office when President Clinton signed the bill making it a national park, and that was a really big day for Black Canyon. And Alan Belt, who's shown here in the suit, he was the BLM manager and agreed to help make this happen. Tom Macy, Christine Quinlan of TCF uh, were instrumental, as I explained. And anyway, it was a really great thing. So this was such a big deal nationally and even internationally. There were 138 media inquiries and stories about it. And this was, I was standing there being interviewed by a TV station. One of these where the TV guy, he's asking questions. He's got the camera on his shoulder. I mean, it's a one person show, And he asked me, he said, "So what's that rock over there?" He's looking at the painted wall and these dikes that were there. And I said, "Schist." And he said, "We can't say that on TV." He said, you got to come up with something else. So we talked about it, and they, of course, edited that out, so it wasn't in there. It provided new access to the Red Rock Canyon, which is spectacular and had been closed off because it was private property. But the one kind of thorn in the side was 112 acres owned by Tom Chapman. And if you're local, Tom Chapman likes to develop properties inside wilderness areas and national parks and get top dollar for them. Anyway, that 112 acres was still private and could be subdivided. And it was right on the rim. You can see where it was. And so I was really concerned about that. I actually got government action to force the purchase of that property. A new administration came in and said, "We don't do that." They threw it out, so it just languished. Then, luckily, about 7 or 8 years later, I was superintendent up at Acadia National Park, and I had been working with Roxanne Quimby, Burt's Bees, if you know that woman. She's a wonderful lady. Anyway, I got her to start buying properties for national parks as part of her philanthropy. And including, she bought 10 in Acadia for Acadia National Park. But this 112 acres at Black Canyon was always in the back of my mind. And I said, "You really ought to go out there and look at this." So she did. She went out, and then she sent a representative to negotiate with the Chapmans. And an appraisal came in. His price was really high. And I thought it's probably not going to be supported by an appraisal. But here's the thing. I don't think there are any real comparables to this property. Right on the rim, surrounded by a national park. So I argued to Roxanne. I said, she asked me what it was worth. And I said, "Well, first of all, there are no comparables." And I explained why. And then I said, "I think it's priceless." And she said, "I like that." And she bought it. She paid a couple $1 million for this property and eliminated that threat forever, which was just fabulous. Anyway, so that property sold and it became part of Black Canyon, and that's the end of my Black Canyon story. And I want to, yeah, sure, absolutely.
So I'm curious, I have two questions.
Yep.
So after you guys stepped in and the conservation, thank you, 17.
Yeah.
So after they stepped in, then were they just a stopgap? And how did that work once it became a national park? Did it?
Well, TCF and other private conservation groups often will buy land for the National Park Service, hold it, and then work to get an appropriation to cover the cost and basically buy them out. And that's what happened at Black Canyon. It also happened several times at Acadia with a different land trust, buying land ahead of time, holding it until we could line up appropriations through Land and Water Conservation Fund and then buy it. And sometimes the land trust will just buy and hold for long periods of time with no intent of,
So
buying.
What did that play out?
So she donated those 10 tracts that she bought inside Acadia, and she donated Black Canyon piece to the people of the United States on the centennial of national parks. That was,
Tax credits.
she probably did, but I don't think that was,
It was not.
no. And she ended up buying land in other national parks as well as part of her grand gift in 2016. So, see if I can get this one to come up.
How did you meet her and how did you start that conversation of this is how you should spend your money?
So when I went to, when I moved from Black Canyon to Acadia, she had a summer home up there in Maine, and I knew she was an important person in the world of conservation. She hadn't bought any land at that point. And anyway, I just went over one day and met her, and we sat around and talked for half a day. And so I periodically would go over there and meet with her and just kind of talk. And so this was all in the newspaper, so I'm not telling any secrets here. She sold her half of her interest in Burt's Bees for $180 million. And she established 3 foundations. One of them was a land foundation called Elliottsville Plantation. And she wanted to buy land to make a national park in the North Woods. And so she ended up buying, she spent $25 million buying, I think it was 80,000 acres, I believe, up in there, that ultimately became Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. President Obama made it a national monument. And that was all because of Roxanne doing all of that. Anyway, so she got this $180 million. And we were just talking, and she said, "What do you think I ought to do with it?" I said, "Well, you could really be helpful to Acadia." She lived right on the edge of Acadia. I said, "We have all these properties, which I'll tell you a little more about in a minute. And maybe you could help by buying some of them." So she started buying them. She had a guy that she would send so that, because if she personally showed up there, everybody thought big money, And then the rest of that story is that one day, she came in our conversation, she said, "I just got another big hunk of money." Turned out to be another 180 million. So she had $360 million. And she said, "I've been thinking about doing these projects in third world countries." And I said, "Well, there are other people doing that, but nobody's doing what you're doing, which is buying land and gifting it to the American people from national parks." And she liked the idea. So I contacted a bunch of friends. They all sent me proposals of one piece of land they needed with a map and so on. Anyway, I gave all those to Roxanne in a notebook, and she started going through the notebook, buying properties and donating them to the people of the United States. It was a great, for some reason, my cursor is on the blink here. I don't know why. See if I can get that to come up. Maybe. Here we go. Okay. So, slideshow. I don't know why my cursor is not working. Okay, so a little bit about Acadia National Park. So when I went there, it had 2.5 million visitors a year, and it's now up to 4. And Acadia is mostly off the mainland. It's 19 coastal islands and one big piece on Mount Desert Island, which most people go to as Acadia National Park. It's mountains and lakes, it's streams and wetlands, historic structures. It's really a magnificent place. But it's a patchwork quilt of ownerships. Rocky Mountain National Park, where I worked, is one big rectangle, and there are 3 entrances and exits. Acadia, you can be in and out of it multiple times in one day and hardly know it in many cases. So it's a very different kind of national park. It has 120 miles of hiking trail, including these ladder trails, which are historic. And so we still maintain them, where you actually have to climb iron rung ladders as part of the hike. There's carriage roads built by John D. Rockefeller Jr. Anyway, the status of current land protection is kind of interesting. 36,000 acres in fee ownership, and 80% of that was donated. That's pretty amazing. And then there are, when I was there, 207 conservation easements, which were really important. So it's, as far as I know, the only national park that has two boundaries. It has a fee ownership boundary where we're supposed to acquire everything inside of it. And then it has a much larger easement boundary where we could acquire conservation easements. And 95% of those were donated, and they cover 12,000 acres. So it's really, really important piece of the program. We had a full-time person who did nothing but work on conservation easements in terms of monitoring them, building relationships with the owners, and so on. Anyway, the biggest challenge when I got there were a bunch of properties inside the park that were privately owned. And as you can guess, being all land people, land is the very essence of any park. And we can't really expect to preserve the resources without doing something with the land. And as I mentioned, there were two boundaries. So what is shown here, Mount Desert Island is where I would say 80, 75 or 80% of the park is on that one island. And you get to that island by a causeway, so you don't really feel like you're on an island. You don't take a boat to it. And then over here is the Scudic Peninsula, that tip. That was 2,000 acres. And a funny story there is that this national park was actually named Champlain National Park in the early years. And there was a guy named John Moore who owned 2,000 acres there on the Scudic Peninsula, which is what's shown there in green. And he was going to donate it to George Dorr, the first superintendent of the park. And John Moore died suddenly, and his two daughters said to George Dorr, we're not going to donate any. I said Champlain, I'm sorry, it was Lafayette National Park. But they said, we're not going to donate any land to a park named after a Frenchman. They had some bias against the Frenchman. So Dorr went to Congress and got the name changed to Acadia National Park. And they then donated these 2,000 acres. And the interesting thing is, Acadia is actually a French derivative too. But it's not a French man, which I guess was the whole thing. So, so they donated that. Well, when I got there, there were 130 private tracts, 40 of which were undeveloped. And so those became my highest priority. And you know why land protection is important. So my vision was to get those 40 tracts. And I called it filling in the holes. Everybody in the public can quickly understand filling in the holes. And so that was my mantra. We want to fill in the holes. So, well, Roxanne, as I said, she bought 10 of them. And we got the local conservation group, the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is an excellent land trust. We built a four-way partnership with donors, including Roxanne, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Friends of Acadia, which is a friends group helping the national park, and the Park Service. So four-way partnership. We ended up buying 31 of the 40 tracts, or protecting 31 of the 40 tracts. And I talked a lot about spillover effect. So if there's a private property inside a preserved area, a lot of things can happen on that property that spill over to what's the preserved land around it, whether it's noise pollution, light pollution, water pollution, any of those things obviously affect beyond their little boundary. So that I talked about filling in the holes and spillover effects as my, so I use this as kind of my mantra there. And that four-way partnership, we ended up acquiring, actually turned out to be 31 parcels and over 500 acres inside Acadia. Those islands there, those are the Porcupine Islands. They're all within the national park, and we own all of those except one. And that owner refuses to sell. But while I was there, a new threat came up. This 3,000 acre Modena property owned by a family in Italy. And I say to be continued because that's my last little story, which I'll tell you here in a minute, if I can get into that one. Okay, so
When did Acadia become a national park?
let's see, 1916. No, it became a national monument in 1916. It became a national park in 1929. Lafayette National Park. And then it became uh, Acadia. So as I say here, land protection has always been my highest priority. Job one, I call it, wherever I go. And the Scudic district, remember that's the piece that was donated by the two daughters over on Scudic. That's the only mainland part of Acadia, and it only gets 10% of the visitation, which is actually a big blessing because it's a very different experience over there. Very quiet, lovely, and so on. And there's a road that goes around it we call the Loop Road that's right on the water and just above the water line. And it's just one gorgeous drive. Anyway, this 3,200 acres became what I called the most serious threat facing of Acadia. So this is that 2,200 acre piece that was donated and the Scudic district. And this, what you see there in red, not the yellow, but the red, was owned by this family in Italy named Modena. Even the Park Drive was in this little, what I would call just kind of a beauty piece, beauty strip. And had they developed this, they were talking about 850 villas that they were going to put in there and a landing strip and a golf course and all this other stuff. And it was really a huge threat to the park. It would have really destroyed the town of the town over there, Winter Harbor, and it would have really destroyed the experience here as well. So that became my highest priority, working on that, trying to stop that. And I tried all kinds of approaches, but my first approach was just to try to meet the owners. And they were very secretive. I thought maybe mafia. I didn't know. I tried everything to try to get to meet them. I even offered to go to Italy where they were and take translator with me and so on. Anyway, they just basically refused all kinds of approaches. So then I started getting all the conservation groups in Maine together to talk about what we could do, and various land trusts and the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, Conservation Fund, and so on. And at one point, Conservation Fund actually met with one of the representatives of the Modenas to try to buy the property. And he basically laughed them off like, yeah, you'll never pay what this land is worth, kind of thing. Anyway, so I even had a meeting with the governor. We flew around the property in his helicopter, and I was talking about making it a state park. I didn't care how it got protected. I just wanted it protected. And he said, well, he'd be happy to make it a state park, but only if the owners were willing, and they weren't. So the Conservation Fund made an approach and failed. And so I continued to build opposition using the news media, op-eds, any way I could to build up opposition. I got, I had our trail crew make a little trail to an overlook where you could actually point to the property and say, all of that is part of this threat. And they started taking tours to that, again, building public opposition and support, and talking to private individuals too. So I was telling anybody who would listen, as I say here on this slide, about how important it was, and what we needed to do to preserve it was make some kind of effort that would actually succeed. So this is a little simplified version, because the yellow in the middle was, we called the hole in the donut. The Maine Coast Heritage Trust bought an easement on that, and that was a blocking action. The owners of the Modinas wanted to get that property because they wanted it, obviously, to fill in the hole of their property and make it, it had a lake on it. It would have made it much more valuable as what they were trying to do. So the fact that the local land trust bought an easement on it and prevented that was really a big deal. And it was really helpful. So I, in my mind, divided the property into two pieces. The orange part, the north half, south half in red, and the south half was my highest priority. We had to somehow get that or get it protected. And so I was really focused on that. And so before I go there, I want to tell you the story of how I finally did meet the Modinas. I put on so much pressure that they had a project manager ready to develop the property. And they had a big public meeting in Winter Harbor. Population of Winter Harbor is 200, and there were 250 people at the meeting. So, and the developers were telling what their plans were for the property, and for the first time, public. And the project manager came up to me afterward, and she said, "I understand you want to meet the Modinas." And I said, "Yes, I sure do." And they said, "Well, if you can be in Boston next week, I can arrange a meeting with Vittorio Modena, the son." I said, "Great, I'll be there." So how are we going to know who's who and how are we going to meet? So I said, let's meet under the Legal Seafoods, that's a restaurant, sign in Terminal A at 8:30 next Wednesday morning. And he agreed. She agreed for him. And so I show up, Boston Airport, Terminal A, Legal Seafoods, and there's this guy standing there in glasses, tall, Vittorio Modena. So we sat in the food court and talked for an hour and a half. And he said, the property's not for sale. And I said, well, that's really too bad, because I think we could, put together a group that would buy it. He said, well, if it were for sale, he said it'd be worth $200 million. And I said, $200 million? I said, well, that's way outside of our, realm of possibility, and it's not even realistic price. And he said, that's if all of our plans are approved. He said, if they're not approved, he says, just as raw land, he said, it's probably worth $29 million. So I thought, oh, 20, now we're going in the right direction, at least, we're going down. And so we talked for a while longer, and I said, well, if you would ever sell the south half, just that piece, please let me know. We would. And so we exchanged contact information, and we departed. And so at one point, he sent me an email follow-up, and he had all the pieces broken out. And the coastal piece, you can see there's a little island over there and a coastal piece. He said that coastal piece and that island, that's worth $10 million. And this is worth $19 million, and so on and so forth. And I said, well, it's unrealistic, but let's keep in touch, and so on. So anyway, that was kind of where it's at. And so Acadia National Park is really interesting in the sense it has a summer community of very wealthy people. We're talking 8 or 9 billionaires and many millionaires. You can't even count the number of millionaires. And they have this really intense social life in the summer when they're there. Garden parties and all kinds of things. Well, this garden is the Rockefeller Garden. And it's a famous place, and they have a lot of parties there in a tent right there on the green. And Maine Coast Heritage Trust had its annual party there, and I would always go to these events when I was invited. And so I was at a very small cocktail party one night, and I was talking to one of these individuals who's very wealthy, and he said, what about biking in Acadia? And I said, well, you can bike on the carriage roads, but my favorite bike ride is on the Scudic Peninsula on the park road because it's so incredibly scenic and it's beautiful. And I said, you go down one side and up the other. I said, the only problem is you got to go out on this county road to get back to where you started. I said, someday I'd really like to connect them. He said, well, what would that take to do that? And I said, well, there's 3,200 acres of land in the way owned by this family in Italy, and we need that land in order to make that connection. He said, well, what would that take? Well, I said, well, we'd have to buy it, and I'm not even sure it's for sale. He said, how much would that cost? And I said, I really don't know, but I'd say at least $10 million. And he said, I could do that. And I thought, is he saying is he just bragging that he's got millions of dollars, or that he really might do that? So I just kept talking, and he said, no, I have a foundation. We could buy that land. So I went home, I got maps, and I got stuff, and I took it over to his house, put it on his front porch, called him, and I said, I put a package on your front porch. And that was in August. In December, he owned the land. And how did he do that? So private individual, he didn't have to worry about appraisals. He didn't have to worry about anything. He just said to his staff, buy that land. And he paid $12 million for it. Cash. Yeah. And yeah, it's relationship building, you know. But the story is not over, because he bought the entire piece, and then he sends his driver. He had a driver to get me, pick me up. We go over there, and he says, "Where's that bike trail going to go?" And I said, "Well," and I showed him on a map, and then we drove to the spot, and I said, "It's got to go over the ridge right here." He said, "Great." He said, "What else should we do?" And we started talking about, well, I don't know. I said, you could, build trails or bike paths on the property. You could put a campground in. He said, sounds good. So he hired a planning team. Actually, he had me meet with the planners, and he said, let's do it. And before it was over, so this was the old piece here. This is the new piece. He put 8.5 miles of multi-use trail, bike trail on that, 4.5 miles of new trail, hiking trail, a visitor information center, which I'll show you in a minute, and a small maintenance building and a 2-unit employee house. He did all this as part of his gift to the American people, and he undergrounded a utility line. Anyway, it turned out to be $40 million gift between the gift and everything he built. And I said, hey, we're going to need a dump truck probably and a pickup truck. He bought them. It's nice to be in that situation. So now, I mean, all these years later, that was in 2000, let me see, 13, I think. He undergrounded the utility lines along the access road to it. $1.5 million it cost to underground them because they had to blast granite. And this is the information center. They had 8,000 people through there one of the first summer months of July. And a beautiful building and campground, hiking and biking trails. So these people all have their thumbs up. So this individual who wanted to remain forever anonymous was in the last part of his life. And so I went over there one day after everything had been done, and I went into the campground. I went along the bike trail, and I said, so give me a thumbs up. The individual who donated this to the people is in bad health. He'd love to see results. So I got all these people to give the thumbs up in the various places in the park, including this bike connection. And I sent it to him just as a thanks. It was really great. And then the local town, they loved it too, because I asked the grocery store, which was just on the verge of going out of business, after 1 year of the campground being open, their business went up 25%. And the 5 and 10, which is kind of laughable because it's not 5 and 10 anymore, but in town there, they said the same thing, that their business had gone way up. And of course, campers, there were 94 sites in the campground, which means about 250 people a night in the campground. They had to buy groceries, of course. They had to buy, sometimes go to the restaurants or what have you. So it really helped the local economy without overwhelming it, like an 850 villa thing would have done. So just one last funny thing. You see that dry camp fire
Yeah.
wood? So in Maine, they don't pronounce the R's. So this guy thought it'd be funny, instead of saying firewood, he just put fire, because that's how they would pronounce it in Maine. Fire. You've heard of Bahaba? You know?
So they took the R out
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So,
So question, so he donated directly to the National Park Service. So he bought the property, donated it to the National Park
yeah, he did actually donate it to the National Park Foundation
Foundation.
as a step to, I arranged that so that it would help protect his identity.
Sure. And then he had say of what he would like to have done on that.
Yeah, but he basically left it up to me. He hired the planning team and he said,
Go for it.
he actually pointed to me, he said, this is your customer, And so when the plans that were developed, we had a landscape architect, so on this team. I had them approved by the Park Service in Denver, the Denver Service Center. And, so everything was transparent at that point, except who he was. Man, it worked great.
So in my understanding, he just donated the bottom part, or he did the whole.
Well, so that's a good question. Interesting, because the answer is interesting. What we did, we split it in half. The bottom half 1,600 acres came to the national park. The top half went to Maine Coast Heritage Trust, the land trust, and Scudic Institute, which is an education research facility on Scudic at a former Navy base. And so they're using it as a research forest.
Sure.
And so, but the whole thing is preserved and was donated. Yep. So these were my lessons learned in 38 years of working for the national parks. And I'd say that the top line is the most important to me, which is a guy named Drucker. He's a management guru and very famous, written lots of books, Peter Drucker. He said management is about doing things right, and leadership is about doing the right things. And it's really true. And so I think having your priorities, having a focus, and maintaining that leadership, doing the right things, is really so important. And staying true to the mission, of course, you all know that, and would be doing that. And perseverance, never give up. That certainly paid off in terms of the Acadia gift. I mean, I worked at that I'd say I spent 5 years making that my priority and trying to get something to happen. And you just never know when the right stars line up and something does happen. And meet the owners, build support, all those things, build opposition. You try every avenue, and creative thinking is valuable, and so on. And use process to your advantage, time to build support and relationships. And then thank all those who helped and keep them informed along the way. Celebrate success. We did all that. We had the Senator Angus King did a ribbon cutting and actually spent the night in the campground in his RV and so on. And so it was really great. I don't know how much time we have left, but I could tell you one. How much time do we have? Okay, good.
It's 10:50, so you technically have 40 minutes.
Okay, all right. Well, so another funny story is, so the donor, Yeah, the donor had agreed to the idea of a campground, but he said, what is camping anyway?" He said, "Why do people camp? Is it just to save money?" And I said, "Oh no, it's about the family experience, about being out in nature and so on." And so I convinced he and his wife. I reserved a campsite in Blackwoods Campground inside Acadia, one of our existing campgrounds, for an evening, basically. And I had a golf cart delivered over there, and I had them come to the campground at 5 o'clock one day, and I was going to make dinner for them in a campsite. But more importantly, I was going to tour the campground when everybody was there making dinners and kids were playing and doing all these things. And I was driving him around in this golf cart, showing him all this great family activity and everything going on in the campground. And he got interested in RVs, big RVs. He said, "So, how much would one of those things cost?" And I said, "A couple $100,000, I'm sure." And he said, "Wow." He said, "Well, I guess that's not cheap overnight accommodations, is it?" And I said, "No, that's not what camping is all about." Anyway, we had dinner in this campsite, and I think it really convinced him that camping was something different than he thought it was. And after that, he was really enthusiastic about a campground and was totally behind it. So
I think that big thing was huge because there's a very limited amount of campground space on. I don't know.
that's right.
Extra space right there, part of the parking lot.
Yeah, and it's 100% full now all summer. Yeah, and it's been on a couple top 10 lists as the best campgrounds in the country. And one reason for that, and I forgot to mention this, is I said, you need our biggest complaint at Blackwoods Campground is generator noise. Even though we limit the hours that people can use the generator, everybody, of course, wants to charge their iPhone and plug it in, plug it here, you know. And we used to actually have conflicts develop in the restrooms because people would plug their phones in the restroom, and then somebody else would come in and unplug that one and plug theirs in, you know. And so anyway, I told him, I said, generator noise is the biggest complaint in Blackwoods Campground. If we could eliminate that one thing, it'd be great. Let's put electric to every single site. So they had a tent loop and an RV loop, and they put electric at every tent site. Just a one, actually a dual plug, and people could plug their phones in and do all these things at their campsite, and no generator noise. It's like dead silent over there in the evening, and it's wonderful. And people know that, and they compliment the fact that they're have a nice natural experience with no generator noise. And so it made a big deal. And so the Park Service then started pointing to the Scudic Woods, that was the name of the campground, as a model. The other thing he insisted on when we did that dinner thing in the campground, he said, these sites are too close together. There needs to be more vegetation between them. So when we built the Scudic Woods campground, we put 100 feet between each campsite. And people love that too. So it's got this reputation now as being one of the best camping experiences in the national parks. And the regional directors point to it as a model. Now, with the turmoil in the national parks now, who knows if it'll ever happen again. But anyway, so that's the story. Did anybody have any questions or comments or anything they'd like to hear more about?
Do you have anything else to say about Rocky? You said you worked at Rocky too?
Yeah, I worked at Rocky Mountain for 6 or 7 years as the deputy superintendent, and that was a great assignment, and I really loved that assignment. But as deputy there was chief of operations, so everything that happened during the day was that person's responsibility. Superintendent was kind of on another level in terms of what he was responsible for: planning, politics, budgeting, the bigger picture stuff. And I dealt with the daily detail. So even though I was able to do some land conservation there, working with the Forest Service, um, uh, that was probably my least land oriented position. But Rocky Mountain, even that old national park, had some in holdings in it that needed to be acquired. And, they make slow progress when one comes. You pretty much have to deal with willing sellers. And so when one comes available, you try to act quickly. And usually it means you've got to engage a partner like Conservation Fund or the local land trust and buy and hold until they can acquire. And that happened several times. And the Forest Service there was one piece of land called the Wedge that overlooked the Kawanishi Valley, and it had 10 private properties. And it was hard to get to, but once you got there, you had this incredible view of the Kawanishi Valley. And I was worried that none of them were developed. And I was worried about people building cabins on this piece of property called the Wedge. And so I had a couple of our people go over there with a giant, I think it was 4 bed sheets all put together, and they were orange. And I had them hold them up so that I could then be down in the Kawanishi Valley and take pictures and show people at this one event. I said, see that orange up there? That could be a cabin. That could be a house with lights and blah, blah, blah. And that people said, oh, I see the importance of that. And we started acquiring those 10 tracts to prevent development. And when I left, I think we had acquired 6 or 7 of the 10. We being the Forest Service and the Park Service and Land Trust. So, working together, we were able to accomplish that. But
Broader question for you, with all the funding cuts and not really understanding that kind of impact on the national parks. As an individual, what is the biggest impact that we can have on a national park that is on the positive side?
well, I think now speaking up to your representatives in Congress about how important it is it's really all of our national heritage
Absolutely.
that's involved. And what's being done, there's no concern for the consequences or long-term implications. And they're really very drastic implications. And Black Canyon operates with one superintendent for Black Canyon, Curacani, and now Florissant Fossil Beds. So they have a total staff of 74. They have 27 openings they're not allowed to fill, or people that have left. That's over 1/3 of their staff. And yet they get a memo saying you can't close anything. And they get another memo that says, oh, by the way, you can't spend any money on your credit cards over $1, and so on. And basically, their hands are tied. They can't do anything. They're canceling contracts, blah, 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 not firing people. And so you can imagine what it's like to try to manage a park.
Can they access a volunteer position? Like, okay, so we paid this. It's just it's like, okay, we are obviously all for land conservation. We want this to work. We love our national parks.
Yeah.
We see what the uppers are doing.
Right.
And it's like, okay, I'm just a little piece of sand on the beach. What is my impact?
It actually is very significant. If you make phone calls to your members of Congress, if they get enough phone calls, things can happen. I'll tell you an interesting story about Rocky. When I was there, Grand Canyon gets 800,000 overflights by helicopters and fixed wing aircraft every year. And if you've been to Grand Canyon, you stand in an overlook, there's, and there is no peace and quiet anymore, even though they have certain corridors they're supposed to fly in. So anyway, I thought when I was at Rocky Mountain, we need to make sure that never happens at Rocky Mountain. And there was a little operation going over at Grand Lake. And so we started building support for doing something. the mantra there, instead of filling in the holes, was prevent, not mitigate. So at Grand Canyon, the FAA was working with the Park Service to, quote, mitigate the impacts, which was really a joke because the impacts were so significant. But so we wanted to prevent it. So we started working with various groups, including the League of Women Voters, that became instrumental. And they, at one point, Senator Allard, who was the U.S. Senator for the area, for Colorado at the time, he said, I got more mail and more calls on commercial overflights of Rocky than anything else. And he said he became a sponsor, and they actually passed legislation preventing commercial air tours over Rocky Mountain. It's the only national park that has legislative prevention for commercial air tours. And it's great. You can go there now and it's peace and quiet.
So I always think about, writing letters to your representatives and such. I live in an area where all of our representatives are blue.
Uh-huh.
So how does that work?
Well, you got to keep the pressure on. I mean, what's happening now is so pervasive. In other words, it's all throughout government. You're hearing horror stories about the Weather Service, about CDC, about medical research, about park rangers, et cetera, et cetera. And so phone calls help them at least focus and hopefully do something somewhere along the line that will help.
Maybe a garden party.
Yeah.
Seems to be a
Yeah.
very effective, and I mean, honestly, just getting the word out.
Exactly. So I'm on the board of another nonprofit called the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. And we now have 4,000 members. Almost all of them are former Park Service employees, retired, most of them. And we are, quote, the voices of experience. We have what we consider 50,000 years of experience managing national parks. And so we're trying to keep a high profile right now. And the media comes to us because we can tell the truth. Literally the president employees don't dare speak up. I had a volunteer call me from Acadia the other night, and she said that she gave an interview and then was told by somebody that she had to have approval as a volunteer to do an interview with the media. And that approval had to come from Washington. I mean, they're trying to basically stop all opposing voices. And that's where the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks comes in, because we're not worried about our next job and we can tell it like it is. And it's not good. So, but just ordinary citizens too can speak up, and it's so important. Anyway,
Thank you for your service on
Yeah.
the coalition.
yeah, it's protectnps.org if you want to look it up.
Say that again.
Protectnps.org. And and it's a great organization. And if you've ever volunteered in a national park, you can be a member of that as well.